standing outside that boardroom door, watching through the glass. As Madison Sterling fumbled through the most important meeting of her career, I knew my moment had finally come. Just minutes earlier, she had looked me dead in the eye and sneered, "You're just security, Lynn. This is way above your pay grade." Her manicured finger had pointed toward the exit like I was some kind of servant being dismissed. But now, watching her panic as Colonel Viktor Petrov fired rapid questions in Russian that she couldn't begin to understand, I realized that my years of studying languages and my military intelligence background were about to become her downfall and my salvation. 3 months earlier, my life at Technova Industries had been exactly what I had worked so hard to achieve. At 32 years old, I had carved out a respected position as head of corporate security for one of Denver's premier defense contractors. My corner office on the 14th floor overlooked the Rocky Mountains, and my linguistics degree from University of Colorado combined with my military intelligence background had made me invaluable during international negotiations. CEO Robert Sterling had always treated me with the respect my expertise deserved. He understood that my fluency in Russian, along with my deep knowledge of Eastern European military protocols, gave Technova a significant advantage in the competitive defense contracting world. My colleagues in the security department looked up to me, and executives across departments regularly sought my input on sensitive international matters. The morning Madison Sterling walked into our Denver headquarters fresh from completing her MBA at Stanford, everything began to shift. She strode through the marble lobby wearing a charcoal gray Armani suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, her blonde hair swept back in a perfect chignon that screamed expensive salon maintenance. At 26, she possessed the kind of confidence that only comes from never having to prove yourself to anyone. Robert Sterling had called an emergency executive meeting that Tuesday morning to introduce his daughter as our new Vice President of International Relations. The conference room buzzed with polite applause as Madison took her place at the mahogany table, but I noticed the uncertain glances exchanged between department heads. None of us could ignore the obvious nepotism at play. "Madison brings fresh perspectives from her business education," Robert announced, his pride evident as he beamed at his daughter. "She'll be spearheading our expansion into new international markets, particularly our upcoming negotiations with Eastern European military contracts." Madison smiled graciously, but when her gaze swept across the room and landed on me, something cold flickered in her blue eyes. During the introductions, when Robert mentioned my role in international security protocols, she interrupted with a dismissive wave of her hand. "I think it's important we distinguish between actual business strategy and basic security oversight," Madison said, her voice carrying just enough sweetness to mask the condescension underneath. "Moving forward, I'll handle all substantive international discussions. Support staff can focus on their designated responsibilities." Support staff. The words hit me like a slap across the face. In one sentence, she had reduced my 8 years of expertise, my military service, and my specialized knowledge to nothing more than glorified guard duty. After the meeting, I approached Madison in the hallway, hoping to clarify my role and perhaps establish a working relationship. She was checking her phone, diamond tennis bracelet, catching the fluorescent lighting as her fingers moved across the screen. "Madison, I wanted to discuss how we might coordinate on the Russian military delegation visit next month," I began professionally. My background in military intelligence and language skills could be valuable assets for those negotiations. She looked up from her phone with an expression of barely concealed annoyance. "Lynn, right. Listen, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I think there's been some confusion about responsibilities here. International relations requires sophisticated understanding of business dynamics, cultural nuances, and strategic thinking. It's not really about knowing a few foreign words or playing soldier. Playing soldier. The casual dismissal of my 5 years serving my country in military intelligence felt like acid in my throat. I had analyzed classified communications, briefed generals on Eastern European security threats, and earned commendations for my linguistic analysis work. But to Madison Sterling, daughter of privilege, it was just playing soldier. I understand business strategy, I replied, keeping my voice steady, despite the anger building inside me. But these particular negotiations involve Russian military officials who value cultural respect and technical expertise. My experience could help ensure we present ourselves appropriately. Madison's laugh was light and musical, the kind perfected at cotillion classes and charity galas. Oh, Lynn, you're sweet to worry, but I think you're overestimating the complexity here. Business is business, regardless of the language people speak. Competent leadership can navigate any cultural situation through professional excellence. She patted my shoulder in a gesture so patronizing it made my skin crawl, then clicked away down the hallway in her designer heels, leaving me standing there with the bitter realization that the next 3 months were going to test every ounce of my professionalism. By the end of that first week, Madison had made her intentions crystal clear. During our departmental coordination meeting, she announced that she would be streamlining international protocols by centralizing all foreign communications through her office. When I pointed out that security briefings required specialized knowledge of threat assessment procedures, she waved off my concerns. But I'm sure you can handle basic premise security just fine, she said, not even looking up from her leather portfolio. But the grown-ups need to handle actual diplomacy. The room fell silent. Every person at that table knew she had just delivered a devastating insult. But Madison seemed completely oblivious to the shocked faces surrounding her. She continued discussing her reorganization plans as if she hadn't just reduced a decorated military veteran to the level of a mall security guard. That night, lying in my one-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill, I stared at the ceiling and felt something dangerous crystallizing in my chest. Madison Sterling thought she could waltz into my professional life, dismiss my expertise, and relegate me to insignificance based on nothing more than her last name and trust fund confidence. She had no idea what she had just started. Madison's campaign to undermine my authority intensified with surgical precision over the following weeks. She began arriving early to executive meetings, positioning herself strategically near her father, while making subtle comments about modernizing outdated security practices and we are bringing fresh energy to international relations. During a routine briefing about updated threat assessments for international visitors, Madison interrupted my presentation to question whether someone with a purely security background could adequately understand the nuanced business implications of foreign partnerships. Her tone remained professionally sweet, but the message rang clear to everyone in the room. I was out of my depth. Perhaps we should consider bringing in actual international business consultants for these important negotiations, she suggested, her blue eyes wide with feigned concern. I worry that relying on security personnel for diplomatic discussions might send the wrong message about our sophistication level. Robert Sterling shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly torn between supporting his daughter and recognizing my proven track record. Lynn has successfully handled international protocols for years, he said carefully. Her expertise has been invaluable in several major negotiations. Madison's smile never wavered. Of course, Dad, I'm not questioning anyone's dedication. I'm simply suggesting that as we grow as a company, we need to ensure every department focuses on their core competencies. Security is obviously important, but it's quite different from building strategic international relationships. The subtle poison in her words was masterful. She never directly attacked my qualifications, never raised her voice, never displayed obvious hostility. Instead, she planted seeds of doubt about whether I belonged in high-level discussions, whether my military background translated to corporate diplomacy, whether my presence might actually hinder rather than help our international expansion. The psychological warfare extended beyond professional settings. Madison made a point of learning personal details about my background, then using them as weapons wrapped in silk. During a casual conversation in the break room, she mentioned having lunch at the Cherry Creek Country Club with some Stanford classmates. It's so refreshing to connect with people who understand the pressures of maintaining excellence, she said while preparing her organic green tea. Growing up in certain environments really shapes your perspective on leadership and responsibility. Don't you think? Not everyone has had those advantages, of course, but it definitely creates a natural understanding of how to navigate sophisticated social dynamics. The subtext was crystal clear. She knew I had grown up in a working class family in Lakewood, that my father had worked construction while my mother cleaned offices to put me through college. She understood that my military service had been partly motivated by financial necessity, not family tradition or patriotic legacy, and she wielded that knowledge like a scalpel cutting at my confidence with precision, strikes disguised as friendly conversation. Her most devastating tactic involved systematically excluding me from preparatory discussions about the upcoming Russian delegation visit, then criticizing me for being uninformed about details I had been deliberately kept from learning. She scheduled planning meetings during times when I had security rounds, then expressed disappointment when I couldn't contribute to conversations about protocols I had never been briefed on. I'm concerned about communication gaps in our international preparation, she announced during a department head meeting. It seems like our security oversight isn't staying current with evolving diplomatic requirements. That could create serious problems when we're trying to present a unified professional image to important foreign partners. The genius of her strategy was its deniability. On paper, everything looked reasonable. Madison was taking initiative, modernizing procedures, ensuring appropriate role clarity. But anyone paying attention could see the systematic demolition of my professional standing, the careful construction of a narrative that painted me as outdated, overreaching, and potentially incompetent. She discovered that my father had been laid off from his construction job the previous year and used that information to make pointed comments about understanding the pressures that working families face during discussions about company benefits. She learned that I lived in a modest apartment rather than owning property and made casual references to the importance of financial stability when discussing long term career planning. Each comment felt like a paper cut, small enough to seem accidental but sharp enough to draw blood. Madison was building a case that I didn't belong in the same professional sphere as people like her, that my background made me inherently unsuited for sophisticated international negotiations, that my military experience was valuable for basic security work but irrelevant to actual business strategy. The breaking point came during a Friday afternoon meeting about final preparations for the Russian delegation visit. Madison had spent weeks positioning herself as the primary liaison for the negotiations, despite having zero experience with Russian military culture, no language skills, and no background in defense contracting protocols. I've been thinking about the importance of presenting the right image during these crucial negotiations, she began, her voice carrying that familiar tone of manufactured concern. International partners need to see that they're working with sophisticated, educated leaders who understand global business dynamics. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the conference table before continuing. I worry that including too many peripheral personnel in high level discussions might dilute our message or create confusion about decision making authority. These Russian officials need to know they're dealing with serious business leaders, not support staff. The room went quiet. Everyone understood exactly what Madison was saying and exactly who she was targeting. Robert Sterling looked deeply uncomfortable, but Madison pressed forward with ruthless determination. Therefore, I think it would be best if our security team focused on their core responsibilities during the delegation visit. Crowd control, building access, basic safety protocols. The important business discussion should be handled by appropriate personnel with relevant education and experience. I felt something cold and hard crystallizing in my chest as Madison's words sank in. She wasn't just questioning my role in the meeting. She was orchestrating my complete exclusion from the most important negotiations Technova had pursued in years. Negotiations that my expertise could make or break. Madison, I said carefully, these particular negotiations involve specific cultural protocols and technical security discussions that require specialized knowledge. The Russian military values competence and preparation above social credentials. Her smile was radiant and utterly condescending. Oh, Lynn, I appreciate your concern, but I think you're overcomplicating things. Business relationships transcend cultural barriers when you approach them with the right level of sophistication and strategic thinking. These are professional military officers, not primitive tribesmen. They understand modern business dynamics perfectly well. The casual racism in her comment made me want to reach across the table and shake some sense into her privileged worldview. But Madison wasn't finished delivering her knockout punch. Besides, she continued, her voice taking on a tone of patient explanation, it's important for everyone to stay within their lanes during high pressure situations. Security personnel handle security issues. Business leaders handle business relationships. Mixing those roles could create serious problems if something goes wrong. She was laying the groundwork for my professional execution, and everyone in that room could see it happening. If the negotiations went poorly, I would be blamed for overstepping my boundaries. If they went well, Madison would take full credit for keeping inappropriate personnel out of important discussions. That weekend, I sat in my apartment reviewing every detail of Russian military protocol I had ever studied, every cultural nuance I had learned during my intelligence training, every linguistic subtlety that could make the difference between respect and offense in negotiations with Colonel Viktor Petrov and his delegation. Madison Sterling thought she had neutralized the biggest threat to her carefully constructed narrative of competent leadership. She had no idea that she had just lit the fuse on a bomb that would destroy everything she thought she had built. The morning of the Russian delegation visit dawned crisp and clear with October sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Technova's executive conference room. I arrived 2 hours early, ostensibly to coordinate security protocols, but really to observe the final preparations for what Madison had positioned as her moment of triumph. She swept into the building at exactly 8:30, wearing a navy blue Chanel suit that had probably cost more than I made in 2 months, her confidence radiating like heat from a furnace. Her hair was styled in an elaborate updo that suggested hours of professional attention, and her jewelry whispered expensive good taste rather than shouting nouveau riche desperation. Good morning, everyone, Madison announced as she entered the conference room, her voice pitched to carry just the right note of authoritative warmth. I trust all the final details are in place for our distinguished guests. Robert Sterling beamed with paternal pride as his daughter took command of the room, checking the placement of leather portfolios at each seat, adjusting the angle of the American flag in the corner, and reviewing the agenda with the practiced precision of someone who had never actually managed a high-stakes negotiation but had certainly read about the process in business school. The Russian military delegation should arrive within the hour. Madison continued consulting her gold Rolex with theatrical precision. Colonel Viktor Petrov will be leading their team, and I've prepared comprehensive talking points that emphasize our technological capabilities and strategic partnership potential. She had spent weeks studying corporate speak and buzzword-laden presentations that would have impressed her Stanford professors but would likely confuse or annoy experienced military officers who valued directness and substance over flowery rhetoric. I watched her rehearse key phrases about synergistic operational enhancement and bilateral technological integration while my stomach twisted with anticipation of the disaster ahead. Lynn, Madison said, turning toward me with that practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. I'll need you to handle basic security screening when our guests arrive, then position yourself discreetly in the background during the meeting. It's important that you remain unobtrusive so our visitors can focus on the substantive business discussions. Unobtrusive. The word hit like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral. Of course, I'll ensure all protocols are followed. Perfect, Madison replied, already turning her attention back to more important matters. Dad, should we review the contract terms one more time before they arrive? I want to make absolutely certain we're presenting the strongest possible position. As the delegation's arrival time approached, Madison's nervous energy became increasingly obvious, despite her attempts to project calm authority. She kept checking her appearance in the reflective surface of the conference table, adjusting her posture and rehearsing key phrases under her breath. The weight of expectation was clearly getting to her, but her pride prevented any acknowledgement of doubt or uncertainty. At exactly 10 o'clock, the building's security system announced the arrival of our Russian guests. Through the lobby's security cameras, I watched Colonel Viktor Petrov lead his three-person delegation through the metal detectors, his bearing unmistakably military despite his civilian business attire. He was a compact man in his early 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of alert, assessing gaze that missed nothing important. Madison positioned herself in the executive lobby to personally greet the delegation, her smile radiant with confidence as she extended her hand toward Colonel Petrov. "Colonel, welcome to Technova Industries. I'm Madison Sterling, Vice President of International Relations. We're honored to have you here today." Colonel Petrov accepted her handshake with professional courtesy, but I noticed his eyes already scanning the lobby, taking in details of our security setup, architectural features, and personnel positioning. His two accompanying officers, Major Boris Volkov and Captain Elena Kozlova, maintained similarly alert postures as they followed Madison toward the elevator. "We have prepared comprehensive presentations about our technological capabilities," Madison continued as the elevator rose toward the 14th floor. "I'm confident you'll find our proposals both innovative and strategically valuable for your defense requirements." The colonel nodded politely, but something in his expression suggested he was already forming judgments about Technova's approach to this negotiation. When the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, I was waiting in the hallway to provide escort services, and Colonel Petrov's gaze lingered on me for just a moment longer than casual courtesy required. "This is Lynn Parker, our head of corporate security," Madison said, her tone suggesting I was roughly equivalent to the lobby furniture in terms of importance. "She'll be ensuring everything runs smoothly during your visit." "Miss Parker," Colonel Petrov said with a slight nod, his English accented but precise. "Your security arrangements appear quite thorough." Before I could respond, Madison was already guiding the delegation toward the conference room, chattering about Technova's impressive growth trajectory and market positioning. I followed at a discreet distance, officially there to monitor security protocols, but actually positioned to witness Madison's inevitable collision with reality. The conference room had been prepared with meticulous attention to visual detail. Madison had arranged for premium catering, fresh flowers, and leather-bound presentation materials that projected an image of sophisticated professionalism. Robert Sterling and three other Technova executives were already seated around the mahogany table, their expressions carefully neutral as they prepared to watch Madison justify her rapid promotion to international leadership. "Gentlemen and Captain Kozlova," Madison began once everyone was seated, "let me start by expressing how excited Technova is about the possibility of partnering with the Russian military on advanced cybersecurity solutions." She launched into a polished presentation about market opportunities, competitive advantages, and strategic synergies that would have earned high marks in a business school case study competition. Her PowerPoint slides were beautifully designed, her speaking rhythm was confident and practiced, and her body language projected exactly the kind of executive presence that impressed board members and investors. But I could see Colonel Petrov's expression growing increasingly distant as Madison's corporate jargon washed over the room. His colleagues exchanged subtle glances that suggested confusion rather than engagement, and when Madison paused for questions after her opening remarks, the silence stretched uncomfortably long. "Miss Sterling," Colonel Petrov finally said, his voice carefully neutral, "these market projections are quite impressive, but perhaps we could discuss more specific technical capabilities. Our requirements are quite specialized." Madison's smile never wavered, but I caught a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Absolutely, Colonel. Our technical team has developed cutting-edge solutions that leverage best-in-class methodologies to deliver optimal performance outcomes." The vague corporate speak hung in the air like smoke from a malfunctioning engine, Colonel Petrov leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharpening as he processed Madison's non answer. Specifically, he continued, his accent becoming more pronounced as his patience apparently wore thin. We need to understand your approach to network intrusion detection at the hardware level. Can your systems identify compromised firmware before it executes malicious protocols? It was a highly technical question that required deep understanding of both cybersecurity architecture and Russian military procurement standards. Madison's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered with practiced grace. Our technical capabilities are absolutely state of the art, she replied, her voice maintaining its confident tone despite the obvious evasion. We utilize next generation technologies to provide comprehensive security solutions that exceed industry standards across all relevant metrics. Major Volkov and Captain Kozlova began speaking quietly to each other in rapid Russian, their expressions suggesting growing frustration with the lack of substantive information. I understood every word they were saying, and their assessment of Madison's competence was becoming increasingly harsh. Perhaps, Colonel Petrov said, his professional courtesy beginning to strain. We could speak with your technical specialists directly. These are complex requirements that require detailed discussion. Madison's composure finally began to crack as she realized her prepared presentation wasn't addressing what the Russians actually needed to know. Of course, I can certainly arrange technical consultations, but as the lead on this partnership, I want to ensure we maintain strategic focus on the broader relationship objectives. She was floundering, trying to maintain control of a conversation that was rapidly moving beyond her depth. Colonel Petrov's expression had shifted from polite interest to barely concealed disappointment, and I could see him beginning to formulate an exit strategy. The moment I had been waiting for finally arrived when Colonel Petrov stood from his chair, his body language signaling the end of his patience with Madison's evasive corporate theatrics. Ms. Sterling, he said with formal politeness, I am concerned that Technova may not be adequately prepared for the level of technical partnership we require. Perhaps we should reconsider whether this meeting should continue. Madison's face went pale as she realized her carefully planned triumph was dissolving into professional disaster. In desperation, she made a critical error that would prove to be her complete undoing. Colonel, please don't let our initial presentation concern you, she said, her voice rising with barely controlled panic. I want you to know that Technova takes this partnership extremely seriously, and I personally will ensure that any technical details are handled appropriately by qualified personnel. Then, in a moment of spectacular poor judgment, she gestured toward me with dismissive authority. Lynn here is just security, so she won't be involved in the actual business discussions. But I can assure you that our real technical experts will address all your concerns. The words hung in the room like a death sentence. I felt every eye turn toward me as Madison unknowingly lit the fuse that would destroy her career and vindicate everything I had endured over the past 3 months. Colonel Petrov looked directly at me for the first time since the meeting began, and something calculating flickered in his steel-gray eyes. Colonel Petrov's gaze held mine for what felt like an eternity, and I could see the exact moment when he decided to test Madison's assumptions about who in this room actually possessed the competence he was seeking. The silence stretched taut as a wire before he spoke, his words delivered in rapid, complex reason that required not just language skills, but deep cultural understanding to fully comprehend. Miss Parker, he said, his pronunciation crisp and formal. Я заметил особенности вашей системы безопасности при входе в здание. Можете ли вы объяснить, почему вы выбрали именно такую конфигурацию для защиты от потенциальных угроз со стороны восточноевропейских адверсариев? The question was deliberately technical, asking about specific security configurations designed to counter Eastern European threats and phrased in a way that would expose whether someone actually understood Russian military security doctrine or was simply parroting textbook phrases. Madison's face went blank as the unfamiliar syllables washed over her, but I felt something electric surge through my chest. Without hesitation, I responded in fluent Russian, my pronunciation carrying the slight formal edge that indicated respect for military hierarchy. Полковник Petrov наша система разработана с учетом специфических тактик, которые мы изучали во время моей службы в военной разведке. Мы используем многоуровневую архитектуру, которая учитывает как традиционные методы вторжения, так и современные кибернетические угрозы, характерные для восточноевропейских милитарных структур. The room erupted in stunned silence. Madison's mouth actually fell open as she stared at me in complete shock, her composure finally cracking as she realized that the person she had dismissed as just security was conducting a sophisticated technical discussion in perfect Russian with a high-ranking military officer. Colonel Petrov's expression shifted immediately, his professional courtesy warming into genuine interest as he continued the conversation. Очень импрессивно. Вы служили в американской разведке. Ваше понимание наших милитарных протоколов кажется весьма глубоким. Да, полковник, I replied, maintaining the respectful tone while providing information that demonstrated real expertise. 5 лет в военной разведке, специализация по Восточной Европе и кибернетической безопасности. Я также закончила курс по русской милитарной культуре в Университете Колорадо. As I spoke, I watched Madison's face cycle through confusion, shock, and growing horror as she began to understand that her dismissive treatment of me had just exploded in her face. But Colonel Petrov was now fully engaged, his earlier frustration replaced by obvious relief at finally finding someone who could address his actual concerns. Prevoskodno, he said, then switched to English for the benefit of the bewildered Americans around the table. Ms. Parker, your understanding of Russian military protocols is quite impressive. Perhaps we could discuss the technical specifications that concern us. Before I could respond, Madison found her voice, though it came out higher and more strained than her usual controlled tone. I'm sorry, but I don't understand what just happened. Could we please conduct this meeting in English so everyone can participate appropriately? The cultural insensitivity of her demand hit the room like a physical blow. Colonel Petrov's expression hardened as he processed the implications of Madison's words, and I saw Major Volkov and Captain Kozlova exchange glances that suggested their opinion of Technova's leadership was dropping by the second. Of course, Colonel Petrov replied, his voice carrying an edge of frost that hadn't been there before. I was simply verifying Miss Parker's qualifications to discuss technical matters that require cultural understanding as well as expertise. Madison tried to regain control her training in corporate politics, kicking in despite the obvious disaster unfolding around her. Naturally, we appreciate cultural sensitivity, but as the designated leader for this partnership, I think it's important that all substantive discussions flow through appropriate channels. She was making everything worse with each word demonstrating exactly the kind of rigid hierarchy thinking that Russian military officers found irritating in American business relationships. Colonel Petrov's expression grew increasingly distant as Madison continued digging her own professional grave. Ms. Sterling, he said, with formal politeness that carried undertones of dismissal. In Russian military culture, we value competence and expertise above titles or designated authority. Miss Parker has demonstrated understanding of both our technical requirements and our cultural expectations. Perhaps she should lead this discussion. The suggestion hit Madison like a physical blow. Her carefully constructed narrative of executive authority was crumbling in real time, and everyone in the room could see her struggle to process what was happening to her moment of triumph. I appreciate your confidence in our security team, Madison said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. But I think there may be some confusion about roles and responsibilities here. International business relationships require strategic thinking and diplomatic sophistication that goes beyond technical knowledge. It was exactly the wrong thing to say to a Russian military officer who had spent decades navigating complex international relationships while Madison was still learning to drive. Colonel Petrov's expression shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed offense as he processed her implication that military officers lacked diplomatic sophistication. Miss Sterling, he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made experienced soldiers stand straighter. I have been conducting international negotiations since before you were born. I understand diplomatic sophistication quite well. What I require now is technical competence and cultural respect, both of which Miss Parker has demonstrated while you have not. The rebuke was delivered with surgical precision, and Madison's face went white as the full impact of her situation finally penetrated her shocked consciousness. She had not only failed to impress the Russian delegation, she had actively offended them while revealing her own incompetence in comparison to the person she had spent months systematically undermining. Major Volkov leaned forward and spoke quietly to Colonel Petrov in Russian, his words carrying clear frustration with the entire situation. Полковник может быть нам стоит прекратить эту встречу. Очевидно, что они не подготовлены для серьезных переговоров. I understood every word. He was suggesting they terminate the meeting because Teknova appeared unprepared for serious negotiations. Colonel Petrov nodded thoughtfully, then addressed me directly while pointedly ignoring Madison's presence. Ms. Parker, could we perhaps discuss this matter privately? I have specific technical concerns that require detailed examination, and I believe you may be the only person here qualified to address them appropriately. The request was phrased politely, but its implications were devastating for Madison's authority. A foreign military officer was explicitly requesting to bypass her leadership in favor of speaking with the person she had dismissed as unqualified support staff. Madison made one last desperate attempt to salvage her position, her voice rising with a barely controlled desperation. Colonel, I really must insist that any substantive discussions include appropriate oversight from designated leadership personnel. Corporate protocol requires that international partnerships be managed through proper channels. Her words sealed her fate. Colonel Petrov turned toward her with the kind of expression that had probably made nervous recruits wish they had chosen different careers. His patience finally exhausted with her combination of incompetence and arrogance. Ms. Sterling, he said, his voice carrying unmistakable finality. Your approach to this negotiation demonstrates fundamental misunderstanding of both our requirements and appropriate professional conduct. Any further discussions will be conducted with Ms. Parker exclusively, or we will terminate these negotiations immediately. The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Madison's carefully constructed world of privilege and assumed authority had just collapsed around her, and everyone in that room could see her struggling to comprehend how completely her moment of triumph had transformed into professional disaster. But Colonel Petrov wasn't finished delivering consequences for months of disrespect and dismissive treatment. He stood from his chair with military precision, his gaze moving around the room before settling on Robert Sterling with pointed significance. Mr. Sterling, he said, his voice carrying formal authority, I suggest you reconsider whether Ms. Sterling is adequately prepared for international leadership responsibilities. Her performance today raises serious questions about Teknova's commitment to professional competence. The words hit the room like artillery shells, each syllable precisely targeted to inflict maximum damage on Madison's career prospects. Robert Sterling's face had gone pale as he watched his daughter's professional credibility evaporate in real time, and I could see him struggling to process how completely the situation had deteriorated. Madison's voice came out as barely more than a whisper, all her confidence finally shattered by the magnitude of her failure. Colonel, perhaps we could start over with a fresh approach. But Colonel Petrov had already turned his attention back to me, his expression warming with professional respect as he dismissed Madison as definitively as she had dismissed me months earlier. Ms. Parker, he said, shall we continue our discussion in a more appropriate setting? The private conference room where Colonel Petrov and I continued our discussion felt like a sanctuary compared to the wreckage Madison had left in the main boardroom. Captain Kozlova had joined us while Major Volkov remained with the shell shocked executives, and I could sense the relief in both Russian officers as they finally escaped Madison's incompetent performance. Ms. Parker, Colonel Petrov began in English, though his tone carried the warmth reserved for genuine professionals. I must ask directly, how is it that someone with your obvious qualifications was relegated to a secondary role in these negotiations? The question required careful navigation. I needed to demonstrate professional integrity while addressing the obvious dysfunction that had nearly derailed this crucial partnership. Colonel corporate hierarchies sometimes prioritize different qualifications than military organizations value. My role was defined based on organizational structure rather than technical expertise. Captain Kozlova spoke up her English crisp despite a heavier accent than her superior. In Russian, military competence determines authority. Title without ability is meaningless, even dangerous in serious situations. Her observation carried pointed criticism of Madison's approach, and I could see Colonel Petrov nodding agreement. These were professionals who had navigated complex international relationships based on merit and results, not family connections and inherited privilege. Tell me about your background. Colonel Petrov continued, settling back in his chair with genuine interest. Your Russian is quite sophisticated with military terminology that suggests extensive training. I outlined my military intelligence career, my linguistic specialization, and my graduate studies in Eastern European military culture, watching both officers' expressions warm as they recognized genuine expertise rather than superficial preparation. When I described analyzing Russian communications protocols during my intelligence service, Captain Kozlova actually smiled. You understand our mindset, she said approvingly. American businesses often approach partnerships like conquest rather than cooperation. They present impressive statistics, but ignore cultural foundations that determine long-term success. Colonel Petrov leaned forward, his manner becoming more confidential. Ms. Parker, I will be direct with you because I believe you can handle truth professionally. This meeting was designed as evaluation, not just negotiation. We are considering Technova for much larger partnership than $50 million initially discussed. The revelation hit me like lightning. This wasn't just about one contract. It was about establishing Technova as a preferred partner for extensive Russian military technology needs. The stakes were exponentially higher than anyone had realized. However, Colonel Petrov continued, today's performance raises serious concerns about organizational competence. Ms. Sterling's behavior suggests company culture that prioritizes appearance over substance, titles over ability. Captain Kozlova nodded grimly. Her dismissal of your expertise while demonstrating her own ignorance indicates systemic problems. How can we trust partnership with organization that wastes valuable human resources? I felt the weight of Technova's future pressing down on this conversation. Madison's incompetence hadn't just embarrassed her, it had jeopardized relationships worth potentially hundreds of millions of dollars over several years. Colonel, I said carefully, every organization has individuals who don't represent its best capabilities. Technova's technical teams and operational excellence shouldn't be judged solely on one person's performance regardless of their title. Colonel Petrov studied me intently. You defend organization that allowed you to be marginalized, that demonstrates either exceptional loyalty or concerning naivety. It demonstrates understanding that larger goals matter more than personal grievances, I replied. These partnerships could benefit both our country's security interests. Personal dynamics shouldn't overshadow strategic opportunities. The colonel exchanged glances with Captain Kozlova before responding. That attitude proves wisdom we hope to find in American partners. But practical question remains, how do we proceed when designated leadership has proven inadequate? Before I could answer, the conference room door burst open and Madison stormed in, her composure completely shattered and her face flushed with desperate anger. She had clearly been eavesdropping and finally lost control of her emotions. This is completely inappropriate, she announced, her voice shaking with fury. I am the designated representative for this partnership, and conducting separate negotiations behind my back is absolutely unacceptable. The cultural tone deafness of her outburst was staggering. She had just interrupted a private military discussion with emotional theatrics, demonstrating exactly the kind of unprofessional behavior that would convince Russian officers that American business culture was fundamentally unserious. Colonel Petrov stood slowly, his expression hardening into the kind of military bearing that had probably terrified subordinates throughout his career. When he spoke, his voice carried Arctic precision. Ms. Sterling, your behavior continues to demonstrate precisely why these discussions required alternative arrangements. Professional military negotiations demand emotional control and respectful conduct. Madison was beyond rational thought, her privileged worldview finally colliding with consequences she couldn't manipulate or charm her way past. I don't care about your military protocols. This is an American company, and I represent our interests in this partnership. The statement was so culturally offensive that Captain Kozlova actually gasped audibly. Colonel Petrov's expression shifted to something approaching contempt as he processed Madison's implication that American interests superseded respectful international cooperation. Miss Sterling, he said with finality that brooked no argument, you have demonstrated today that you lack the temperament, competence, and cultural understanding required for international military partnerships. Any future discussions will exclude you entirely, or there will be no future discussions. Madison's face crumpled as the full magnitude of her professional destruction finally penetrated her shocked consciousness. She had not only failed spectacularly, she had burned bridges with foreign partners worth potentially hundreds of millions of dollars to Technova's future. You can't just exclude me, she protested, her voice rising to near hysteria. My father owns this company. You have to work through proper channels. The nepotism argument was exactly wrong for this audience. Russian military culture despised inherited authority without earned competence, and Madison had just confirmed every negative stereotype about American business dynasties. Colonel Petrov turned to me with expression of pained resignation. Miss Parker, I regret that family politics may prevent productive partnership with your organization. This situation suggests structural problems beyond individual performance issues. I realized that Madison's meltdown was about to destroy not just her own career, but Technova's entire future relationship with Russian military contracts. Years of careful relationship building were dissolving because of one person's incompetence and emotional instability. Colonel, I said quickly, what if I could guarantee that future communications would be handled exclusively through qualified personnel? Would that address your concerns about organizational competence? Madison whirled toward me with venomous fury. You have no authority to make guarantees about anything, you're just security. You don't have the breeding or education for these kinds of responsibilities. The words hung in the air like toxic gas. She had just revealed the classist assumptions underlying her treatment of me, demonstrating exactly the kind of social prejudice that would appall military officers who valued merit over inheritance. Colonel Petrov looked at Madison with something approaching disgust before turning back to me with renewed respect. Ms. Parker, your qualifications speak for themselves, but can you actually deliver on such guarantees given current organizational structure? It was the moment of truth. I could either accept the limitations of corporate hierarchy or fight for the partnerships that Technova needed to survive and thrive in competitive international markets. Yes, Colonel, I said with conviction that surprised even me. I can guarantee appropriate professional conduct and qualified expertise in all future discussions. Madison's scream of outrage echoed through the conference room as she realized that her systematic campaign to destroy my authority had just backfired with devastating completeness. The emergency board meeting, convened 30 minutes later in Technova's main conference room, felt like a tribunal preparing to determine the fate of everyone involved in the morning's disaster. Robert Sterling sat at the head of the mahogany table, his face grave as he surveyed the wreckage of what was supposed to have been his daughter's triumphant debut in international leadership. Madison had used the intervening time to compose herself and prepare what she clearly believed would be a compelling narrative of my insubordination and unprofessional conduct. She entered the conference room with renewed confidence, her hair repaired and her makeup touched up, carrying a leather portfolio that suggested careful preparation for this crucial confrontation. "Dad," she began before anyone else could speak, "I need to address the serious breach of corporate protocol that occurred during our meeting with the Russian delegation. Lynn deliberately undermined my authority and conducted unauthorized negotiations that violated every principle of proper business conduct." Her voice carried practiced sincerity as she outlined a version of events that painted me as a rogue employee who had sabotaged legitimate business discussions through personal ambition and inappropriate overreach. According to Madison's narrative, I had exploited language barriers and cultural confusion to manipulate foreign visitors into bypassing proper corporate channels. This kind of insubordination sets a dangerous precedent. Madison continued, her tone warming with righteous indignation. If employees can simply ignore designated authority whenever they disagree with management decisions, we'll lose all organizational coherence and professional credibility. Robert Sterling listened with the pained expression of a father, watching his child dig her own grave with increasing enthusiasm. The other board members shifted uncomfortably as Madison's accusations grew more dramatic and less credible with each passing moment. Furthermore, Madison pressed on, "I have serious concerns about Lynn's qualifications for any role involving international partnerships. Her military background may have given her language skills, but it hasn't prepared her for the sophisticated diplomatic relationships that modern business requires." The irony was breathtaking. Madison was criticizing my diplomatic capabilities immediately after her own spectacular failure to manage basic international courtesy with crucial foreign partners. But she seemed genuinely convinced that her narrative would carry the day based on nothing more than her inherited authority and practiced presentation skills. "I recommend immediate disciplinary action," Madison concluded with dramatic finality, including formal review of Lynn's security clearance and consideration of termination for insubordination and the breach of corporate protocol. The room fell silent as Madison's accusations hung in the air like smoke from a dumpster fire. Robert Sterling rubbed his temples with obvious exhaustion before responding in a voice that carried decades of business experience and growing disappointment. "Madison, before we proceed with any personnel decisions, I think we need to hear from Colonel Petrov directly about what actually occurred during those discussions." Madison's confidence flickered for just a moment before she recovered with practiced smoothness. "Of course, Dad, but I think it's important to remember that foreign military officers may not fully understand American corporate structure and appropriate reporting relationships." The condescension in her voice was staggering, suggesting that a decorated Russian colonel with decades of international experience needed her to explain basic organizational concepts. Robert Sterling's expression darkened as he processed the implications of his daughter's attitude toward crucial business partners. At that moment, his assistant announced that Colonel Petrov was available for video conference, and the wall-mounted screen flickered to life, revealing the Russian officer in his temporary accommodations downtown. His expression was professionally neutral, but I could see the careful calculation in his eyes as he prepared to deliver his assessment. "Colonel Petrov," Robert Sterling began formally, "we're conducting an internal review of this morning's events, and we'd appreciate your perspective on what occurred during the negotiations." Colonel Petrov nodded gravely before speaking with the kind of measured precision that suggested careful consideration of his words. "Mr. Sterling, I will be direct because this situation requires honesty rather than diplomatic courtesy. Your daughter's performance this morning was thoroughly inadequate for serious international business relationships." Madison's face went pale as the colonel continued his clinical dissection of her failures. "She demonstrated no understanding of our technical requirements, no appreciation for military culture, and no competence in managing complex negotiations. Her conduct was unprofessional and culturally offensive. However, Colonel Petrov continued his tone, warming slightly. Ms. Parker demonstrated exactly the kind of expertise and cultural understanding that successful partnerships require. Her qualifications are impressive. Her conduct was exemplary, and her knowledge addresses our specific needs comprehensively. The contrast couldn't have been more devastating for Madison's narrative. A respected foreign military officer was explicitly contradicting her version of events while praising the competence of the person she had tried to marginalize and destroy. Colonel Madison interrupted desperately. I think there may have been some miscommunication about roles and responsibilities. International partnerships require strategic oversight that goes beyond technical discussions. Colonel Petrov's expression hardened as he processed Madison's continued attempts to assert authority despite her obvious incompetence. Ms. Sterling, your strategic oversight nearly destroyed negotiations worth potentially hundreds of millions of dollars to your organization. Your understanding of international partnerships appears fundamentally flawed. The revelation about the true stakes hit the room like a bomb. Robert Sterling's eyes widened as he realized that Madison's failures had jeopardized far more than a single $50 million contract. Colonel Petrov was describing partnership opportunities that could transform Technova's entire international profile. Furthermore, Colonel Petrov continued with military directness. Ms. Sterling's treatment of Ms. Parker demonstrates organizational dysfunction that raises serious questions about Technova's commitment to merit-based excellence. How can we trust partnerships with companies that waste exceptional human resources? Madison tried one more desperate gambit, her voice rising with barely controlled panic. Colonel, I think you may not understand the complexities of American corporate hierarchy. Maintaining proper reporting structures is essential for accountability and organizational effectiveness. It was exactly the wrong argument to make to someone who had spent decades in military organizations, where competence literally determined life and death outcomes. Colonel Petrov's response carried the kind of quiet authority that ended careers and changed institutional direction. Ms. Sterling, I understand organizational hierarchy perfectly well. What you describe is not hierarchy based on competence and responsibility. It is privilege based on family connections and inherited authority. Russian military partnerships require actual expertise, not ceremonial titles. The boardroom fell silent as Colonel Petrov's assessment sank in. Madison's face had gone white as she realized that her systematic campaign to destroy my credibility had just backfired with devastating completeness. A foreign military officer was explicitly recommending that Technova bypass their designated international relations leader in favor of the person she had dismissed as unqualified. Mr. Sterling, Colonel Petrov concluded with finality, any future discussions will be conducted exclusively with Miss Parker, or we will pursue partnerships with organizations that demonstrate greater commitment to professional competence. The ultimatum was crystal clear. Technova could choose between Madison's inherited authority and partnerships worth hundreds of millions of dollars. There was no middle ground, no diplomatic compromise, no face-saving alternative that would preserve both relationships. Robert Sterling looked at his daughter with the expression of a man watching years of careful planning crumble due to factors completely beyond his control. Madison had not only failed to justify her rapid promotion, she had created a crisis that threatened Technova's entire international expansion strategy. Madison, he said quietly, I think we need to discuss alternative arrangements for your role in the company. The words hit her like a physical blow. She had entered this meeting expecting to engineer my termination, and instead found herself facing the destruction of her own carefully constructed executive position. Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper as the magnitude of her professional disaster finally penetrated her shocked consciousness. Dad, you can't seriously be considering siding with an employee over your own daughter because of some foreign officer's opinions. But Robert Sterling's expression had already shifted from paternal concern to corporate necessity. The stakes were too high and the consequences too severe for family loyalty to override business survival. Madison had forced him to choose between his daughter's ego and his company's future, and the choice was no choice at all. 6 months after that devastating board meeting, I stood in the executive conference room that had once been the site of Madison's professional destruction, looking out at the Denver skyline while preparing for my latest video conference with Colonel Petrov and his expanded team of Russian military contractors. The view from my new corner office on the 16th floor was spectacular, but the satisfaction of vindication paled compared to the genuine fulfillment of building meaningful international partnerships based on competence and mutual respect. Technova's transformation had been swift and decisive following that catastrophic October morning. Robert Sterling had moved with the kind of corporate efficiency that built successful companies, immediately restructuring the international relations division to reflect actual expertise rather than inherited privilege. Madison had been quietly reassigned to a junior analyst position in domestic marketing, her vice president title revoked, and her authority reduced to preparing PowerPoint presentations about regional sales trends. The Russian contracts had materialized exactly as Colonel Petrov had promised, beginning with the initial $50 million cybersecurity partnership and expanding into comprehensive technology sharing agreements worth over $200 million across multiple years. My promotion to Vice President of International Security Relations had come with a salary increase that finally reflected my value to the organization, along with stock options that would provide long-term financial security regardless of future career decisions. But the most meaningful change had been cultural rather than financial. Robert Sterling had implemented new policies requiring cultural competency training for all executives, established clear protocols for respecting employee expertise, regardless of background, and created advancement pathways based on merit rather than connections. The company culture had shifted from privilege-based hierarchy to performance-driven excellence, and the results were visible throughout every department. Madison's transformation had been the most surprising development of all. 3 months after her professional humiliation, she had approached me privately to request what she called honest guidance about rebuilding her career and developing actual leadership capabilities. The conversation had been painful, but productive, forcing her to confront the classist assumptions and inherited privilege that had shaped her worldview since childhood. "Lynn," she had said during that awkward meeting in the company cafeteria, "I need you to understand that my behavior toward you wasn't really about you personally. It was about my own insecurity and fear that people would never respect me for anything beyond my father's name." The admission had required genuine courage, acknowledging vulnerabilities that Madison had spent years hiding behind designer suits and practiced confidence. She had grown up watching her father build a successful company while feeling constant pressure to prove herself worthy of the Sterling family legacy, and her treatment of me had been displaced anxiety about her own qualifications and legitimacy. "I was terrified that someone like you with real military experience and genuine expertise would expose how unprepared I actually was for leadership responsibilities," Madison continued, her voice carrying shame that seemed authentic rather than performative. "So I tried to discredit your qualifications before anyone could compare them to mine." The psychological insight was probably accurate, but it didn't excuse months of systematic undermining and casual cruelty disguised as corporate professionalism. Madison's insecurity might explain her behavior, but it couldn't undo the damage she had inflicted or restore the confidence she had systematically attacked. "Madison," I had replied carefully, "understanding your motivations is important for moving forward, but it doesn't change the fact that your actions had real consequences for both of our careers and for Technova's business relationships." She had nodded with apparent sincerity, accepting responsibility without making excuses or minimizing the impact of her choices. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to learn how to be a better leader and a better person. Would you be willing to provide mentorship as I try to rebuild my professional credibility? The request had surprised me with its directness and humility. Madison was essentially asking the person she had tried to destroy to help her develop the competence she should have possessed before assuming executive authority. It was either a genuine recognition of her failures or a sophisticated manipulation designed to rehabilitate her image. Over the following months, I had cautiously agreed to provide guidance while maintaining professional boundaries and healthy skepticism about her motivations. Madison had enrolled in night classes at University of Colorado, Denver, studying international business and cultural competency with apparent dedication. She had also begun volunteering with veteran service organizations, claiming she wanted to better understand military culture and the challenges faced by service members transitioning to civilian careers. The changes seemed genuine, but time would be required to determine whether Madison's transformation represented authentic growth or strategic positioning for future advancement. Either way, her fall from executive privilege to entry-level responsibility had demonstrated that competence ultimately mattered more than family connections in environments where results determined survival. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from Colonel Petrov, interrupting my reflection on the remarkable changes that had transformed both my career and Technova's corporate culture over the past 6 months. His face appeared on the video screen with the professional warmth that had developed through months of successful collaboration. Lynn, he said, using my first name with the casual respect of established partnership, I have excellent news about our proposal for expanding cybersecurity cooperation into Eastern European markets. The Defense Ministry has approved comprehensive partnerships that could be worth over $500 million across the next 5 years. The magnitude of the opportunity was staggering, representing growth that would establish Technova as a major player in international defense contracting. But more importantly, it validated the principle that authentic expertise and cultural understanding created sustainable business relationships in ways that superficial charm and inherited authority never could. That's incredible news, Colonel, I replied, feeling genuine excitement about the professional challenges and growth opportunities ahead. What's the timeline for initial implementation? As we discussed technical requirements and cultural protocols for managing such extensive international partnerships, I felt deep satisfaction, not just about personal vindication, but about the broader lesson this experience had taught about the nature of authentic authority and meaningful success. Madison's attempt to destroy my career had ultimately revealed the hollowness of privilege without competence, while demonstrating that genuine expertise and cultural understanding would always triumph over superficial credentials and inherited positions. The Russian military officers had recognized authentic qualifications because their own survival had depended on distinguishing between appearance and substance, between impressive presentations and actual capability. The story had become more than personal vindication. It had evolved into institutional change that would benefit countless future employees who brought valuable skills and perspectives regardless of their social background or family connections. Technova's new merit-based culture would prevent other talented individuals from facing the systematic undermining and casual dismissal I had endured. Most importantly, the experience had taught me that fighting back against injustice wasn't just about personal dignity. It was about creating environments where competence and character mattered more than privilege and politics. Madison's attempt to reduce me to just security had ultimately demonstrated that security expertise, when combined with cultural understanding and professional integrity, could build partnerships worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The life lesson extended far beyond corporate politics or international business relationships. It spoke to fundamental questions about how societies should evaluate worth and distribute opportunities, whether background and breeding mattered more than ability and dedication. and what kinds of leadership actually served organizational goals rather than individual ego. Looking back on those painful months of systematic undermining and professional marginalization, I realized that Madison had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible, the opportunity to prove that authentic expertise would always defeat inherited authority when tested by real world challenges that demanded substance over style. The experience had transformed not just my career, but my understanding of what constituted meaningful success and genuine leadership. Madison's privilege had crumbled when confronted with actual requirements, while my background had provided exactly the foundations needed to build lasting partnerships with people who valued competence over credentials. Today, as I prepare for another productive discussion with international partners who respect my expertise and appreciate my cultural understanding, I'm grateful for every moment of struggle that led to this vindication. Madison Sterling taught me that just security could become the foundation for everything that really mattered in building successful relationships and meaningful careers. The Russian proverb Colonel Petrov had shared during our first private conversation echoed in my mind as I concluded our call. Truth always rises to the surface no matter how deeply it's buried. Madison had tried to bury my qualifications under layers of classist dismissal and corporate politics, but truth had indeed risen to the surface when tested by people who understood the difference between real competence and inherited privilege. As I settled into preparations for another day of meaningful international partnership work, I couldn't help but smile at the irony that Madison's attempt to limit me to basic security functions had ultimately secured relationships worth hundreds of millions of dollars to Technova's future success. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone underestimated your abilities based on your background or position, only to discover that your unique skills were exactly what was needed to succeed? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if it resonated with your own experiences of proving that competence matters more than connections. Subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who found extraordinary strength when faced with workplace injustice, and share this with anyone who needs to remember that authentic expertise will always triumph over inherited privilege when tested by real-world challenges. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that every setback can become the foundation for even greater success when you have the courage to stand up for what you've earned through dedication and hard work.